Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. If you've ever stepped foot into a classroom or, honestly, even just thought about how people learn a new language, you've probably realized pretty quickly that teaching isn't just one monolithic thing. It's complex. The entire field of TESOL is shaped in massive ways by how we fundamentally conceptualize the very nature of teaching itself. So today, we're going to explore the blueprint of our profession. We'll examine the core conceptualizations of language teaching, look at how they're structured, and figure out what they actually mean for the essential skills every teacher needs. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to be using Zahorik's brilliant 1986 framework to ask, is teaching a science or an art? To answer that, we'll break down science research conceptions, theory philosophy conceptions, and art craft conceptions. And finally, we'll see exactly how these paradigms define the essential skills of teaching. Section 1. Language teaching, science or art, the core paradigms of teaching. Now, this right here is the absolute core dilemma that defines our entire field. Because you see, the way you view language teaching dictates exactly what you believe the essential skills of a teacher actually are. I want you to think about your own classroom experiences for a second, whether as a student or an educator. Is teaching best treated as a science, driven purely by hard data? Is it a technology, like a systematic application of tools? Is it a craft, honed through repetitive practice? Or is it an art, relying entirely on individual intuition and personality? Keep your own answer in the back of your mind, because it's going to color everything we discuss next. Moving on to Section 2, Science Research Conceptions, Empirical and Experimental Approaches. So, this is the first of Zahorik's major categories, and it focuses heavily on top-down empirical investigation. Listen, if you're someone who loves hard evidence and proven formulas, this is totally your domain. According to the text, science research conceptions are derived directly from research, and they are supported by experimentation and empirical investigation. And under this massive umbrella, Zahorik identifies 3 specific sub-approaches. We've got operationalizing learning principles, following a tested model, and doing what effective teachers do. Let's unpack each of these one by one. The first sub-approach here is operationalizing learning principles. Basically, this involves developing teaching principles directly from research on memory, transfer, motivation, and, other cognitive factors believed to be important in learning. It's essentially taking the raw science of how the human brain works and translating it directly into classroom practice. In TESOL, things like learner training, which draws on research into cognitive styles to teach successful learning strategies to students, fit perfectly into this box. And this actually brings us to one of the most famous examples of operationalizing principles, audiolingualism. This method didn't just appear out of nowhere, it was directly derived from behaviorist psychology lab studies. Researchers found that learning could be successfully manipulated through a really specific 3-step behavioral chain. First, you have a stimulus to elicit behavior. Second, a response triggered by that stimulus. And third, reinforcement, which marks the response as appropriate or inappropriate, encouraging the learner to either repeat or suppress that habit. When they translated this into a classroom method, language learning became this intense process of habit formation through rigorous dialogues and drills. Now for a much more recent example of operationalizing learning research, let's look at task-based language teaching. Research eventually showed that successful second language acquisition actually requires learners to actively negotiate meaning. So based on this, Prabhu developed a massive, large-scale syllabus in India centered completely around classroom tasks rather than your traditional grammar rules. He focused on 3 major types: information gap tasks, opinion gap tasks, and reasoning gap tasks. So in this case, the cognitive science literally dictated the entire syllabus. Okay, let's pivot to the second sub-approach, following a tested model of teaching. This involves taking the results of empirical research and applying them directly to teaching acts. A super fascinating example of this is Long's 1984 research, where he contrasted display questions where the teacher already knows the answer with referential questions where the answer is actually unknown. Long's research proved that training teachers to use way more referential questions and giving students a slightly longer wait time to answer significantly boosted student participation and language acquisition. By following this empirically tested model, teachers adopted a highly validated conception of what good teaching looks like. Which brings us to the third sub-approach under science research, doing what effective teachers do. But wait, how do we actually define effective here? Well, the research literature uses a very specific, hard metric. Effective teachers are those whose students perform better on standardized achievement tests. That's the benchmark. Researchers literally go into the field, identify these top-performing teachers, and study their exact practices. For instance, Tikhonov studied effective teachers in bilingual programs in California and Hawaii and found really clear links between a teacher's ability to specify instructional intent and their students' overall accuracy. When you aggregate all this kind of observational research, you get a strikingly clear profile. Blum summarized the characteristics of effective teaching, and we are talking about instruction heavily guided by a pre-planned curriculum, high expectations, and incredibly close monitoring. Honestly, it's almost militaristic in its smooth routines and clear, focused instruction. This is exactly what direct instruction, or active teaching, looks like in practice. It's a highly structured, top-down approach based entirely on empirical observation of what actually gets test results. All right, Section 3. Theory, philosophy, conceptions. What ought to work or is morally right? Now, what's really interesting here is that this represents a dramatic shift. We are completely leaving the realm of standardized tests and laboratory data, and we're stepping right into the realm of logic and ethics. Zahorak defines theory philosophy conceptions as approaches whose truth is not based on a posteriori conditions or what works empirically. Instead, their truth is based on what absolutely ought to work or what is morally right. Proponents of these methods don't defend themselves with pre- and post-test classroom gains. They defend themselves through careful, logical argumentation and deep belief systems. Within this philosophical conception, we basically have a fork in the road with two distinct branches. On one side, we have theory-based approaches, which rely entirely on systematic, principled thinking and rational thought. Proponents of communicative language teaching, for instance, used logical critiques of older grammar-based methods to justify their new approach, and they didn't feel compelled to produce empirical evidence first. Then, on the other side, we have values-based approaches. These are derived from strong beliefs about what is morally, ethically, or even politically justifiable regarding how teachers should behave and how learners must be treated. Let's look at a prime example of a theory-based approach, the silent way. It is completely based on a set of logical claims about how adult learning takes place. Its founder, Gategno, stated, "What teachers must do is to arrange for practice so that students' minds are triggered to use these new words spontaneously." The silent way assumes that true learning comes from inner awareness, not from a teacher's explanation. So the teacher remains mostly silent, using colored rods and actions to guide the students. Gategno took the theory underlying this as entirely self-evident. It was never subjected to empirical verification beforehand. It simply ought to work based on his rational claims. Moving over to the values-based side, these approaches appeal directly to educational or social value systems. This includes things like team teaching, which obviously values collaboration, humanistic approaches like community language learning, which prioritize self-awareness, feelings, and emotions, the learner-centered curriculum, which values learners as self-directed decision-makers, and reflective teaching, which values teachers critically analyzing their own internal assumptions. The core justification here isn't necessarily about who acquires language the fastest, it's about what is most educationally and humanly justifiable in a classroom. Section 4. Art Craft Conceptions, Invention and Personalization. Okay, this is the third and final of Zahorak's conceptualizations, and it is a total 180 away from rigid, top-down methods, whether those methods were based on empirical science or rational philosophy. I want to read Zahorak's exact quote here because it perfectly captures the vibe of this approach. The essence of this view of good teaching is invention and personalization. A good teacher is a person who assesses the needs and possibilities of a situation and creates and uses practices that have promise for that situation. Under this conception, teaching is purely an individual skill. There are absolutely no general universal methods of teaching that apply everywhere. So the real takeaway here is this: teacher decision-making is literally the most essential competency. A good teacher has to analyze a highly specific class scenario, realize that a wide range of options is available, and then creatively select the best alternative. In fact, advocates of the art-craft conception strongly suggest that committing to just one single method actually impedes a teacher's full potential. It's a bottom-up approach where the teacher's unique personality, intuition, and situational awareness absolutely take center stage. Finally, Section 5, the essential skills of teaching, a continuum of practice. So we've looked at 3 vastly different paradigms today, but the source material makes a really critical point. These aren't just interchangeable whims where you randomly pick and choose whatever you feel like doing that day. They represent fundamentally different representations of what the act of teaching truly is. However, they can definitely be viewed as an evolving continuum of professional development. When you step back and look at the whole board, notice how the teacher's role shifts dramatically. Up in science research, your job is to understand empirical principles, develop tasks, and objectively monitor performance. In theory philosophy, you must intimately understand the rational theory and monitor your adherence to it. In values-based, you're selecting means that conform to ethical values and monitoring that value maintenance. But look at artcraft at the very bottom. Treat each situation uniquely, try different strategies, and develop a highly personal approach. Honestly, brand new teachers often start at the top, relying heavily on the safety of proven science research principles. But as they gain experience, as they gain confidence, they tend to move down the continuum, eventually becoming artcraft practitioners who invent highly personalized approaches based on the unique, messy dynamics of their actual classrooms. Which leaves us with this final, rather provocative thought. Where do you currently fall on this teaching continuum? Are you clinging to top-down science, or are you embracing bottom-up artcraft? And more importantly, where do you actually want to be? Whether you lean entirely on empirical data, strict philosophical theories, deeply held humanistic values, or your own personalized craft, understanding the framework behind your teaching is the absolute key to mastering the classroom. Keep reflecting on your practice and, as always, keep learning.